we can be the same, but we're different.
Right.
Or we show up differently.
But a lot of my friends have come here because they're on an educational journey. They're on a career journey.
We can actually coexist peacefully and everyone brings their true identity.
There's a difference if you are North American, if you're Canadians and you were born here. You have to develop that built-in motivator,
Absolutely.
right? You've got to develop it because you're here.
Yeah. When I hang out with you, I show up differently than when I'm hanging out with, let's say, someone from Gambia or Zambia. It's like there's an unwritten code. At what point do you stop being an immigrant? I've lived in 5 different countries, so I think in 5 different ways. But over time, identity becomes personal and mental shifts happen to people.
Because if you're thriving, you're contributing.
Absolutely.
If you've come here, you're probably educating yourself, learning, maybe sharing. And so I think that unless you educate and leave.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody, to the All Things Inclusion podcast. I'm your host, April Howe, first-time podcaster, so this is new. Super excited to be here, and I'm really excited to start talking about some of the things that we're going to start to unpack. I am joined by my good friend and co-host, Ken Oguzi. Ken, thank you. This is going to be fun.
Yep, this is going to be fun. Thank you very much, April, and I'm really looking forward to this. My name is Ken Oguzi once again. I am the CEO of Active Research and Strategy Group. And today we're here to talk about the All Things Inclusion podcast, which is very exciting. Something April and I have been cooking for a while. So I'm glad we're really getting to do this.
So you say cooking for a while. Yeah. So when we were coming to the studio.
Love food, so I love to cook. So, you know.
That's completely unrelated. You know that.
Yeah,
okay,
true.
I'm just saying.
That's
so I was, when we were coming up to the studio, a very dear man, Victory, was asking me, well, whose idea was this podcast?
Yep.
And I had to think about it because I've been talking about it for a while. You've been talking about it sort of a little bit separately.
Absolutely.
And you brought us together, really. That was you. So I have you to thank for this. And I also have you to blame if this goes down in flames. All you. All you.
Typical you, but it's okay.
So look, we are really excited to start having some conversations. And the one thing I think that we should maybe start with is we decided pretty early on that we're not going to decide what the topics are.
Yep.
We want people to tell us the things that are hard to talk about.
Yep.
And then we'll talk about them.
Absolutely.
We're doing the work for you people.
Absolutely. I agree. And I think that's what we're all about, right?
Yeah.
You know how you and I get into some of these random, spontaneous conversations?
Just out of nowhere.
I think in this case, we let the viewers, they decide, they tell us what they want to hear, and then we just run with it. Because hopefully we don't get to things that we, you know.
Well, here's my goal.
Still,
here's my goal. To not get canceled. That's my goal.
Oh yeah, that's true.
That's all.
That's true.
So I think we should aim for that.
Yep, I agree. I agree.
But look, I do want to get into something because I had a really interesting conversation or an experience the other day. So I had some friends over. These are beautiful women that I've known for some time. So had them over. And 2 of them are from Nigeria and 1 is from Zambia.
Absolutely.
So we're all sitting around and these are my sisters, right? Like I know these women.
Yeah.
And I realized in the conversation that I felt different.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I felt like this difference between myself and these women.
Okay.
Now, I get it. I'm born and raised in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm African Nova Scotian. I've been African Nova Scotian for 55 years. And these women came from, their countries, the continent of Africa.
Okay.
And so, but I'd not really seen difference before or experienced it. Like black is, there's that connection.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk today about those differences
Mm-hmm.
within the culture,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it would be no different than if we said someone was Scottish versus Irish, for
Irish, of
instance.
course. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? In my ear,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it sounds so similar, but I'm sure those are very different cultures.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I wanted to get your take on that, first of all. Like,
Mhm.
what do you, when we think about, and let's just use you and I,
Yeah.
right? Let's just use you and I.
Yeah.
So the differences between us. So what makes us so different and what makes us so the same?
Mm-hmm.
So what's your 2 cents?
Well, first of all, I want to start by, letting the viewers know that, I'm Nigerian, so member of the African diaspora living here.
So am I, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. And you know how, and it's important because you talked about difference, but then we can be the same, but we're different.
Right.
Or we show up differently.
Right.
And so the first thing I want to ask you now, was there a particular moment you saw that difference, or was it throughout the whole conversations, or were there certain times as well which you also realized that we actually also have a lot in common? Because I think in my experience, I have seen that, when I talk about how we see things around Black people doing stuff, and I meet, my brothers and my sisters who are African Nova Scotians, and we speak, and they're like, we're doing this. I'm like, oh, you do this too? Because I'm thinking, these are, you have your heritage here.
Yeah.
I was born and bred in the continent.
Yes.
How did these small behaviors or tiny behaviors, how did they cross the Atlantic Ocean? Now, some people would say they've always been there, but I sort of felt like if we've been sort of living in two different parts of the world for so many generations, did we keep all of this? Those are all conversations that come to mind. So I don't know what your thoughts are. Though.
No, I agree. You didn't answer my question, by the way, but that's okay. That's okay. That's okay. So I agree with you.
Yeah.
There's also those things that are so similar in the way we celebrate things, the enthusiasm in which we celebrate things. Yeah. Church is another place that the way that we experience church. Yeah. Because Black people love themselves some church.
Absolutely.
Okay. Don't matter if you're Canadian or anywhere on the continent. Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a lot of similarities. You're right. But let me just tell you what struck me in this discussion I was having. Yeah. Okay. So there was 2 particular moments when we got on the subject of food.
Okay.
So not just specifically the kind of food that is traditional in Zambia and in Nigeria, but the way they talked about it, and when they got excited about it, I started to not be able to pick up. I couldn't hear everything.
Oh, I see.
Like their language started to shift.
Okay.
And so I thought, why am I not, I couldn't really fully engage.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
I got a lot of it, but not all of it. Yeah. But they had clicked in a different way based on that cultural conversation that I didn't feel I had access to.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know what? Thinking about that, I can see that. I can see that because when I look at my personal experiences or how I show up in spaces, when I hang out with you, I show up differently than when I'm hanging out with, let's say, someone from Gambia or Zambia. It's like there's an unwritten code in terms of how I show up.
Really?
Yes. And it's interesting because you will think that, when I talk about, I show up in a certain way in a professional setting because, that whole piece on inclusion, I'm bringing your whole self to spaces.
That's a whole other podcast.
Absolutely. But then you will think that if I'm hanging out with you, for example, April, 2 Black people, I would show up the same way if I'm hanging out with a friend or someone else who, we share the same relationship, but from the continent.
Right.
I actually show up differently in both settings.
So can you bring words to that difference, like how you show up differently?
So even the sort of jokes that I would probably joke around, because across the continent, there are a lot of things that, you might say this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, which if we brought the way we sort of pay attention to it or brought it in certain cultures, even here, even when me and you are having conversations, I kind of feel like I'm not sure how you would take this particular one, but I'm sure how if I met someone who's from Zambia or
Right,
Gambia,
right.
it's almost like 90%, I'm sure that, yeah, they would find this funny, or they would find this funny. This would be acceptable to them. So, that's one piece out there. And then the second piece to which I also want to highlight is that you mentioned the fact that when they started having those conversations, you started feeling like you were not really catching on in terms of the way they were engrossed.
Yes.
I mean, that's a good thing because, of course, that meant that they felt comfortable around you.
So take it as a compliment.
Absolutely.
Okay.
However, I mean, inclusion is one thing. So maybe they probably did not include you in that conversation. I don't know.
I don't think it was intentional.
Of course, yeah.
It wasn't intentional.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just realized that they were speaking in a way that it just seemed like more of them came into that conversation. And I just couldn't pick up on all the nuances of the conversation. So I didn't feel, I wasn't excluded. I just couldn't find a way to feel fully included. But I respected it. Like I totally respected it. So I just think, when we think about differences between, African Canadian, African from the continent, and right, that's kind of the language we use, and that we're all part of the diaspora, the African diaspora. But I think it's okay to have and recognize difference.
Absolutely.
But what I find is that there are positives and negatives to that, right? And one of the negatives, in my opinion, is that sometimes it feels that that the different Blacks that show up in society aren't connected, and that there's separation in those communities. And I think a lot of people, if you're not really truly understanding sort of Black society, so if you're a white person in our society, you might assume that all Black people are the same and connected and together. And I think because of the cultural component, like the one I experienced at that, having those friends over, I think that people gravitate to what they know and what is comfortable.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So a friend of mine told me you always have to remember that the brain favors the familiar.
Absolutely. 100%.
In every way, shape, and form. That's why we don't like change. That's why we want to be with people like us, that look like us, and talk like us. The brain favors the familiar. It's comfortable. But with that is the separation in different Black groups. And so you see it. I see it. Does that sound accurate? Does that sound like, is what I'm saying making sense to you?
Yeah, it is making sense. It is making sense because it's not, I don't think it's a conversation that most people are unfamiliar with.
Sure.
And I think it's something that a lot of us are still trying to navigate.
Right.
First of all, for me, I think the starting point is education. I find that a lot of things people carry on, which has sort of created this, I don't want to say discord or something, or, some of the, small levels of conflict or something like that. It's just because people don't understand both perspectives, or we don't have people who are in the middle who can see both without being emotional around it. Like I always say, there are so many things you might not agree, but you can understand.
Yes.
That if I find myself in this situation from this community, from this continent, I might probably show up this way.
Right.
But then when people show up that way, do you judge them? Do you feel like, oh, why are you showing up this way? Not understanding their story, not understanding their perspectives. And sometimes it feels like a competition. I've seen people, it's almost like who's been through a lot more, or who's a priorities, or who's suffering oppression.
The Suffering Olympics.
The Oppression Olympics.
The Oppression Olympics.
That's what it's called, So sometimes I've seen that.
But
in my opinion, I just think people just need to pay attention and, spend a bit more time educating themselves.
Right.
As an African diaspora, and of course, I am, because of the fact that I do work around inclusion. So at least to an extent, I have been able to sort of, have some level of education on historic, communities.
And experiences, right? And connectivity with
Absolutely.
different people.
So that sort of helps me. But I think it's both ways in terms of, both groups really taking time to learn from each other, understand each other. But the first most important thing is understanding that let us not try to feel like because we're all Black people, we always have to be, I don't want to say, because not really like saying that we all have to act a certain way or behave a certain way just because we're Black people.
Right.
No, we can actually coexist peacefully, and everyone brings their true identity, regardless.
Preach.
You know, and that's what I think. I don't know if you're with me on that thing.
Well, I am with you. I am with you. I still want to unpack the problem a little bit because this is the podcast that talks about the things that are hard to talk about. Yeah. And one of the things that's hard to talk about, and I've had this conversation many times, but nobody wants to talk about it openly, is the idea that there is actual conflict. Conflict might be too strong of a term. Tension.
Tension. I would say tension. I like that, yeah.
And I'll even go beyond the African diaspora and be inclusive of those of Caribbean identity, right? So African Canadians, and so those that are sort of born and raised, right, of North American, descent, not descent, but socialization, and then African, and then Caribbean, and that there is a disconnect and a pull or push away from each of those three groups. And there's a lot of thinking around why that is. I have a little bit of a hypothesis. Because, so I am born and raised North America. I am from Africville, Nova Scotia. Been here, my family's been here for 400 years, over 400 years. And obviously I know a lot of Caribbean people that have come here or are second generation Caribbean, Canadian, and many African friends that have come from Africa. And I always talk about the difference between being born here and this is home versus coming here because you have a purpose. And not to say that African Canadians don't have purpose. That's not my point. But a lot of my friends have come here because they're on an educational journey. They're on a career journey. And it took a lot of work for them to go through the immigration process and all the hurdles that it takes to come to Canada or maybe, for some US, wherever it is that you decide to go. So you're coming here with this built-in motivator, drive to get something done.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that, I think, in and of itself is almost its own society. Right? People that have come here to go to school, to learn and take advantage and really have a wonderful, amazing Canadian experience. Everybody I talk to loves it here. They love it here. Doesn't mean they're not going to go home at some point, but they love it here. So the difference between coming with an eye on the prize, right, that is not just impactful to you, it's impactful to your mother and your brothers and your grandmama. So there's a lot of that built in. And I think there's a difference if you are North American, if you're Canadians and you were born here, you have to develop that built-in motivator, right? You've got to develop it because you're here. And so I'm not saying that that's, the answer, but I'm saying that in and of itself, I think creates a really different social space.
Absolutely.
Because you talked about the way you show up. Well, part of showing up is your intent for school and your drive to learn and educate and so on and so forth. So it's not about any one group being better or more motivated. I just think we've all come here and are here with different motivators.
Absolutely. But do you think sometimes the motivations might pass a wrong messages to the group? So for example, you might have, sometimes you might have people maybe who are from the African diaspora who feel like, okay, I'm in this, I'm in spaces, I'm working hard, I'm growing, and I've met people from the African Association community who it's almost like they're not happy seeing me progress in some of these spaces, or they feel like I'm taking up spaces that they should take up.
Right.
And I feel like I came all the way here no connections, nothing. I found
Right.
my way here. I worked hard, and I'm where I'm supposed to be. So why am I supposed to feel bad about my
Right.
success or my progress? How is it my fault that I came here and I'm like this?
Mm.
But then you also have, and I'm just telling you what, some of these you hear in those
Of
conversations.
course, we've all heard this. Yeah.
Absolutely. I also have some of my, my friends from the African American community who've also said things like, okay, we've been here long enough and we have put in a lot of sweat and blood to create opportunities for everyone, for Black people as a whole.
Yes.
And then some people have come from the continent, and it's almost like all of a sudden when the food is ready, they just come and start eating. So,
right. I've been cooking dinner.
Exactly.
I've been cooking. I went and got all the ingredients.
Absolutely.
I chopped it up.
Absolutely.
And you showed up at the table.
And you eat it. And sometimes you eat it and you're not even giving me credit for the food. So,
not even telling you that it tastes good.
Absolutely. So you can see where these two narratives make sense in both narratives, in my opinion. I think I see why anyone would see it that way. Now, whether it's valid 100%, that's a whole new conversation because it's hard to really undermine people's personal experiences or perspectives because you don't know where they're coming from. There are a lot of people from the continent who also come in with a lot of trauma.
Yes.
Because people talk about trauma, but people come from the continent with a lot of trauma. But then you also have African Nova Scotians who will be here for 400 who suffer a lot of intergenerational trauma, dealing with all of that trauma. And this thing shows up in some of the conversations both groups have. So I think that realization that, people's stories are different and we can find middle grounds where everyone understands and respects where each other are coming from rather than all the assumptions, and it's almost sometimes it feels like the usual resources, minimal resources, everyone dragging, pulling left and right. Like I should have more, you should have more. I mean,
I agree, and look, it's not a competition.
Yeah, exactly.
And
it's never been.
I am a proponent of people thriving wherever they need, whether it's here, whether it's somewhere in Europe. At home in Africa for you. Yeah. So I don't care where you go to thrive.
Absolutely.
Because if you're thriving, you're contributing.
Absolutely.
If you've come here, you're probably educating yourself, learning, maybe sharing. And so I think that unless you educate and leave, which some do, but a lot of people stay.
Absolutely.
And now you're contributing.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not into this whole thing about someone taking a spot because, I've been cooking and chopping and now you're eating. I'm okay to cook for everybody. And I know a lot of
Even if you don't get credits for the food you made, like even if no one acknowledges how awesome your food is or says, hey, thank you for all the food that you've done. Would you still be okay
I don't think you do it. If you're doing it authentically, I don't know that you need credit. I don't care. I don't need credit. And I think a lot of people don't, right? If you're having conversations and expanding mind thoughts and creating space, whoever fills that space, as long as they are deserving, I'm good, right? And I feel a lot of my colleagues and friends feel the exact same way. So I think that's really interesting. And I think that leads me to another part of this conversation that's important. Okay.
I wanted to jump on something real quickly.
Okay.
So you talked about we looked at this clear distinction in terms of history, 400 years, 53 historic communities, African diaspora. But then there is a very fundamental group of people whom a lot of times we've not really thought about.
Okay.
And those are my children. So my kids. The
next generation.
Born in Nova Scotia. So now I talk about identity. I'm not sure if you want to jump into identity, but I just talk about identity where for me, identity is fluid for different individuals and people pick whatever they want. I'm happy to sort of play within the African space and living here space. Like my life is interwoven, so you can't really draw a distinction.
Right.
I mean, mine is even more complicated. I've lived in 5 different countries, so I think in 5 different ways. I'm a mess, let's put it that way. But then when you look at things like my kids,
yes,
and the kids of most of the African diaspora, born here.
Mm.
We teach them the African culture, but listen, it's just a watered down version. It's still not good enough. The
A
reality
watered
is
down
that-
version.
That's what it is, because culture is something you need to be in culture to really be part
Right.
of it. It's
You have to
not-
experience
experience
culture.
it. It's not
Okay.
what you teach. Like I'm having teachers teach my kids Igbo language via Zoom, for example. Like that's
Sorry, say that again?
teach my kids my language. Like,
Oh.
like I have a teacher who teaches them the language
Yes.
using Zoom.
Yes.
You know, because sometimes I get so carried away that I don't even remember to teach them the language. But that's a whole new conversation. But the point I'm driving at is that when we look at inclusion, inclusion is a feeling, right?
Yeah.
And it's not so much about what the other person is doing about it. It's about ultimately the biggest judge of inclusion is the person whom you're looking to make feel included.
Right.
So I can say I feel included in the community because I've found my space and I'm good. It's all good for me.
Mhm.
When I then look into those kids, like my kids and the kids of those whom
My granddaughter.
your
yes.
granddaughter, the only realities, for example, my kids have is Nova Scotia.
Right.
But in 20 years from now, when they are adults, would we still want to be drawing distinctions between, oh, Ethan, my son, you're not from a historic community. And he's like, so where do I belong? Oh, you're from Africa. What are you talking about? I only visit Africa once in, 5 years.
Right.
All I know is Dartmouth and Bronson. Like, that's all I know. Like, this is where I grew up. This is all I know. So how do we, now those conversations are coming. I know this for sure. And I've been saying it, they are coming at one point. Because when you have those kids from those two groups now, for you and I, it's a different type of conversation.
Right.
Because it's almost like, I wouldn't say I have one leg here and there, but I have a lot of connections there. And genuine, authentic connections.
Yes.
Not connections because that's where I'm from. It's natural for me.
But you've lived all over the world.
Yeah.
You've lived all over the world. You've been in the UK, you've been in Africa, you've been in Canada, you've been in the US, you've lived in Sweden.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you have all of these different, really amazing experiences. To contrast that with your kids, to your point, right? Their experience is solely Canadian.
Absolutely.
And so what you're saying is, like, the importance of ingraining that African culture in them, one in which they've never truly experienced.
Absolutely.
And as a man, and we talk about legacy, how do you ensure that African, because you're a proud African man.
Absolutely. I am.
How do you ensure that proud African legacy continues on if your kids weren't brought up in it, tasted it, felt it, touched it, and smelled it? It's just not the same.
And most importantly, they are not called African Nova Scotians. Because they don't come from the historic communities. So what are they?
What are they here?
Yeah. Are they going to be called African diaspora? They're not diaspora. If you look at the definition of diaspora, it is people who somehow came from the continent. And these kids, they are connected to the, so it's a,
okay, so
it's
here's
a
my
conundrum
question.
for me, so.
Are they African enough?
These are all conversations.
So that must be, that sounds very unkind.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That sounds unkind. But there is in our culture, I mean, and it's not just Africa. This is any culture. Are you Italian enough? Are you, American enough? Like, there are things there are boxes to be checked that tell you, right or wrong, if you are enough of your culture. And so the watered down version of what your kids get, right? So that dilemma with, continuing on legacy, but your point is in Canada, and in particular, because we're in Nova Scotia, who are your kids while they're here?
Absolutely.
What community do they belong
to? And we can say, oh, you're African, you have African origin, but those are more over time. That's what I'm telling my kids, right? But over time, identity becomes personal and mental shifts happen to people.
Yes.
So where would he or my kids or these kids, where would they go and they feel the most natural being in those spaces? When I go to Nigeria, I feel a different way. I feel like this is it
You're
for
home.
me. I feel like I'm home.
You're
It's
home.
not what I was told. It's not what anyone sold to me. It's not
Right.
what my father told me.
Right.
This is home to you.
Right. You just know.
I just know.
You feel it.
Absolutely. And that is the way those kids will feel when they are in Nova Scotia, like my kids and some of the kids of the diaspora. But then they would go into spaces and they could be told that, but you're not African Nova Scotian because you don't
Right.
come from
You're not from Cherry Brook. You're not from North Preston. You're not
Exactly.
from East Preston.
Yes.
You're not from, Lake Loon or Truro or any of the
Exactly. Yes.
many
Yes.
Black communities.
Yes.
And so that's how we identify.
Who is from?
So when you start talking about identity
yeah.
within Black African
Yeah.
culture, it is in and of itself its own mix of challenges.
Absolutely. I
Right.
agree.
So, there's a lot of talk going on. And you actually mentioned this when we were chatting earlier about identity and definitions.
Oh, yeah.
Because I've had so many people come to me and say, so April, I don't know how I should refer to you. Is it okay if I refer to you as Black?
Yeah.
Or do you prefer African Nova Scotian,
Yeah.
or do you prefer African Canadian,
Yeah.
or of African descent?
Yeah.
So yes, and yes, and yes.
Yeah.
They're all fine for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
But a lot of us feel very particular about what, grouping, what bucket, if you want to say, what cultural bucket
Yeah.
we fall into, and
Yeah.
therefore the definition.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to know.
Yeah.
So every survey you fill out,
Yeah.
it's something a little
It's
bit different.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right? It's
Absolutely.
different.
They're all different.
Right.
Yeah.
And how much identity matters to anybody.
Yeah.
Anybody.
Yeah.
And so we have a little bit of this conundrum around, what do we want to be called? Like, what is the definition of African Nova Scotian?
Yep.
What is the true definition of African Canadian?
Yeah.
And I do have a few of those definitions right here. And I'm not going to read them all out, but the interesting part of this.
Yeah.
So African Nova Scotian community refers to someone specifically, a descendant of Black individuals who were brought to Nova Scotia, brought to Nova Scotia, primarily during the period of the Atlantic slave trade. So that is a key component to our identity. I don't love that it is, but that's how some organizations, some governments are looking to define African Nova Scotian. Another one is the African diaspora. So the African diaspora is of individuals of African descent who are dispersed globally. So I'm African Nova Scotia. I'm also of the African diaspora or diaspora, however you like to pronounce it. And so are you.
Yeah.
Right? The next one is African Canadian.
Yeah.
So individuals of African descent living across Canada, including those in provinces outside of Nova Scotia. So it's so interesting that Nova Scotia is being sort of mentioned in that, because I don't know that it needs to be, right? If you're African Canadian and it says that individuals living across Canada of Black descent or African descent, that should really be enough for the definition.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So those are just a few of the very specific definitions. And the African community, for the most part, I think buys into them, but not everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
So where's the challenge, do you think, with the definitions?
Well, I think, so this is always, you and I know and understand, I agree on this. Identity is a very complicated stuff.
Very.
And the same way you talk about how you have two people, same background, same,
Differently the same.
Differently the same. Or even people who, two members of the African diaspora. And let me just even give you a very basic example. Immigrants. We talk about at what point do you stop being an immigrant? 20 years, 10 years. There are people who feel in 5 years, the moment they become Canadian, for example, they don't want to be referred to as immigrant. There are people who carry the immigrant title with a lot of pride. 20 years, they want to be called an immigrant because they said being an immigrant represents resilience, strength, all this piece, personal, right? So we bring it back to identity. In my opinion, some of these definitions are definitions that are been agreed upon. But the question is, when you have a definition that is agreed upon and certain individuals don't think it covers, or for them they don't agree with it, they disagree and all of that, how do you box them into those groups and agree to carry them with pride?
Right.
Especially thinking about the society we live in, which, we're trying to make things as fluid as possible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
When you think about it, historic African Nova Scotian community makes so much sense. The African diaspora makes so much sense. But I always believe that there are always going to be gray areas in those things. And depending on what you're talking about, it will show up differently. Because I gave you a very basic example of my children, for example. Diaspora involves certain movements from, and that movement has to come from maybe economic, education. But when you look at that generation I'm talking about, there's no movement for them. They were born in Nova Scotia.
Right.
So when you now look into identity, you say, okay, thinking about your day-to-day interactions, thinking about everything you've learned, thinking about everything you know, all of those. When you bring 3 of those kids and say, what do you identify? What would you want to say? I can bet you all 3 would not tell you they want to be identified as African diaspora. You might have one saying, I want to be as African diaspora.
I don't even say that.
Yeah, well, exactly. So you can see why sometimes the definitions are, and you and I, we've talked about this, and why sometimes definitions are very tricky. And right now, I can tell you there's a lot of work in the community around these definitions. People are sort of, pushing it back and forth. What should be the right one? You see different organizations using certain definitions, different from the other.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't know if it is that some have not caught up with it, or some are thinking, we have to be very careful because it can actually exclude certain groups of people. That's the problem.
It's true.
Yeah.
So, we sort of push back on terms like BIPOC, for instance. You're right. But we also haven't landed on the perfect definition. And here's my thing.
Gosh.
If we don't know,
I know.
How's everybody else supposed to know?
Absolutely.
So we can't get too much up on we can't get our back up too much when someone uses the wrong term.
Absolutely.
Because we don't even know or we haven't landed on the perfect term for ourselves.
But I think the bigger question now would be, April, and I put it to you as well, why does definition matter?
Why does it matter?
It matters for sure, but what are some of the implications that we can think of that, because definition sometimes is also problematic. I get it, policy, all of these pieces.
Sure.
But a very key component of definition is resource allocation.
Resource allocation. So explain that.
So basically what I mean is that resources. Resources that need to be spread across groups.
Whether it's government resources, not-for-profit.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
So who gets what?
So that's why definitions matter.
100%. And that is why it's become very contentious, because that's what it is. And I talk about things like racism, slavery, so many. Everything comes down to resources, scarce resources. That's if you fundamentally draw parallels to it, think about what the end goals of those things were. When you talk about slavery, what was slavery? People were, we see these people as below us, we pick them, we sell them, money.
Right. Building wealth on the backs of free labor.
Absolutely. So it came to resources because at the end of the day, and because money is scarce, of course, so you have to labor to get it. So people go hook or crook just to make money. If you brought it back to the same conversation now, why can't everyone just say, identify as this? That's your problem.
Because you just said why. Because how do we identify and then allocate resources, programming,
if we don't,
whatever, if we don't know who is in a particular group?
Absolutely. And that is why it still remains very, very complicated. And that's why you still see some of the tensions happening. Because at the end of the day, when you trace some of the triggers which has happened lately around this conversation, there is a resource component to it.
I never really thought about it that way before.
That's how I've been, because I've been sort of paying attention to it, because I've seen there are a lot of things you see play out in spaces that you could apply the same principles to other things. You know, I lived in Malaysia where it was like, you know, you had like the Indians, the Malays, the Chinese, all coexisting. But sometimes there were friction, and it all came to resources at the end of the day. You know, people are like trying to bump heads and, you know, creating all these programs, who is what, and all these pieces. There was even conversations around, you know, the Chinese Malaysians in comparison to the Chinese from the mainland. There was that conversation. Who really was who are, and then it all still came to resources at the end of the day.
So I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I hear your point about resources, but I also think just pure identity, just for the sake of identity, 100%. Matters in this conversation as well. April. Right? 100%, because you're talking about the core of who somebody is and where they came from. And that matters to almost all people.
I agree.
At a certain degree.
I agree.
And I don't want to position this conversation as though this only happens in the African diaspora.
I know, exactly.
This is not unique to Black people.
Yes.
Right?
That's why I brought that example, just to...
It's a perfect example. It is not unique just to Black people, but in the context of this conversation,
I agree.
I think that's a really, really important point.
I agree. And I think for me, even for beyond just policy, you know, we talk about in workspaces where you have like a Black person working there, and, you know, you might have, it could be in the private sector. And someone will come to me and say, hey, Ken, listen, we're looking to do, you know, a project on Africville. Can you really help us out? And I'm like, do you want to do a project on Abuja in Nigeria? I can help you out.
Right.
You want to do that?
For
Africville, I don't think I'm the best person. However, maybe
but Ken, you're Black. You should know all things
absolutely.
Africville. So it doesn't work that way, right? Because our cultures are so different and differently the same.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you can see how, you know, Nova Scotia and Black people in Nova Scotia, we occupy a very interesting space. The dynamics are so different. You know, they are so different, and, you know, compared to other parts of Canada. And you just saw an example in that definition you gave where you talked about Nova Scotia was explicitly mentioned. And you're like, we are very special. We're very special.
We're very special. I agree.
You know?
Okay. So this was a good conversation. Yeah. We need to have more of these kinds of conversations. And I hope that people listen, because this is a conversation we would have in private.
Absolutely. That's true.
So now we're exposing our private conversations.
I know.
So just so that people can hear and learn, we don't know everything. We don't know all the things.
Absolutely.
But we certainly want to try to have all the conversations.
Absolutely.
So we want to thank you all for listening in to our first podcast. Whoop!
Yep.
First podcast. Praying we don't get canceled. I think we're good.
Yeah.
And Ken, where can they find out more? Where can people send information on stuff they'd like us to talk about?
Yeah, that's important, April, because I think, you know, one thing we agreed we would achieve with this podcast is we want people to tell us what they want us to talk about. You know, those things people don't sort of want to talk about.
They don't want to say it out loud, but they're curious. They want to know.
Yeah. Even sometimes for fear of being canceled. So you and I have dedicated our lives to working on the risk of being canceled. And it's okay, right?
It's all right. It's all good.
Are you good with that?
I'm very good with that.
Okay. All right. So just wanted to be sure.
Okay.
So, you know, for viewers who want to find us, who want to know where we are, you could always send an email to allthingsinclusionpodcast@gmail.com. And of course, you can follow us. Please follow us on all our social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our YouTube channel, All Things Inclusion Podcast. That's what it would be. So, you know, send us emails, send us your comments, send us what you want to hear, what you want us to talk about, and let's do it. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you, and we will see you next episode.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.